All right, hello everyone. We are going to go ahead and get started with our meeting today. I would like to thank you all for joining us. We appreciate your time and participation. My name is Ali Yamnitsky and I am with Environmental Management and Planning Solutions, a contractor with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and I'm going to be one of your meeting facilitators today. Additionally, I have several members of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service with me on the meeting today who will be introduced in a moment. Here is our expected meeting agenda for today.
Oh, sorry, Ali. Actually, we're going to hold on a minute and we're going to let some more people join the meeting first,
Okay.
Since we have a lot of participants here. Thanks.
All right, again, welcome everyone to today's meeting. We will give folks just a few more minutes to join the meeting, so please stay tuned and we will start the presentation shortly. I want to note that closed captioning is available by selecting the closed caption icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen, if you are using the Zoom web portal or the Zoom app on your computer. Hello, everyone. We are going to go ahead and get started with our meeting today. I would like to thank you all for joining us. We appreciate your time and participation. My name is Ali Yamnitsky, and I am with Environmental Management and Planning Solutions, a contractor with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and I'm going to be one of your meeting facilitators today. Additionally, I have several members of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service with me on the meeting today who will be introduced in just a moment. Here is our expected meeting agenda for today. I will first go over some brief logistics for the meeting. Then the service will provide a PowerPoint presentation on the Red Wolf Management Program update. The service will then hold a question and answer session to respond to participants' questions. Finally, the service will provide some closing remarks and we will close out the meeting at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. Before we get started with the presentation, I'm going to go over some logistics for the meeting. First, this meeting is being recorded as a part of the project record, and a recording will be posted to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service website. Second, your microphones and videos will be turned off for the duration of the meeting today. The host will unmute you only if needed to during the question and answer session. Questions will be addressed during the question and answer session after the PowerPoint presentation. As of right now, we are going to go first through our list of questions that were submitted upon registration and that are within the scope and ability of the Fish and Wildlife Service to respond to at this time. We will do our best to address the questions in the order they come in and to allow everyone an opportunity to voice their questions today. I will now turn it over to Amanda Biederman.
Great, thank you, Allie. I'll go ahead and put you on mute. And at this time, Shannon Estenos with the Fish and Wildlife Service is going to provide some opening remarks. So let me go ahead and ask her to start her video and ask to unmute here.
All right, Amanda, can you hear me and can you see me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you, Amanda and Allie. I am Shannon Estenos. I'm actually the Assistant Secretary for Fish and Wildlife and Parks at the U.S. Department of the Interior. And as the Assistant Secretary, I actually oversee the policy decisions of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Park Service. I'm dialing in this evening from Washington, D.C. And mostly I'm here to listen and to learn, but I did want to take just a few minutes to provide some opening remarks for tonight's session. I had the wonderful opportunity to travel to North Carolina just before the holidays and to learn more about red wolves and about the beautiful Albemarle Peninsula. I was able to visit the North Carolina Zoo. I was so grateful for the warm welcome that I received from scientists and landowners, from state leaders, members of the public that I had the opportunity to meet while I was down there. It was also really great to spend time with our dedicated Fish and Wildlife Service staff exploring the region, because I have found that for me, the best way for me to understand an issue, particularly a big challenging issue like red wolf conservation, is to sort of see things for myself and talk to folks on the ground. And really, my visit to the region and my conversations with folks in North Carolina have really persuaded me that if we dedicate ourselves to good communication, to transparency, and to collaborative conservation, we will be able to embark on a renewed vision for red wolf recovery. And that's really what tonight's meeting is all about. It's about communication, it's about transparency, collaboration, and new beginnings. So I want to thank each and every one of you for taking the time out of your evening, your busy schedule. This is family time for many of you, and you have chosen to spend it with us. And we are so grateful. I want you to know how grateful we are. I also want to especially thank our valued partners from the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission, who are also here this evening. Communities and countries all over the world are dealing with this crisis of extinction, and stemming the crisis here at home in the United States is a key priority for the U.S. Department of the Interior, and we're working throughout the country to recover species that face the threat of extinction. And this really is our goal for the red wolf, which is, of course, America's only endemic wolf, meaning that it's the only, unlike the gray wolf, which lives in the United States and in Mexico and in Canada, red wolves only live in the United States. So in many ways, it is America's wolf. And it is also the most endangered canid in the world. The Albemarle Peninsula is a really critically important region for the continued existence of the red wolf. So while we know there is widespread interest in our work that we're doing on red wolves, and we welcome that interest, we want to encourage interest in our work, we really wanted to engage also directly with the communities and partners in Eastern North Carolina. So that means engaging directly with folks in Beaufort, Dare, Hyde, Terrell, and Washington counties. So many of you have been with us since we celebrated the first release of red wolves into the wild back in 1987, after they had been declared extinct in the wild just 7 years earlier. That release was the first time that a large carnivore was reintroduced after having been declared extinct in the wild. And it continues to serve as an important milestone for reintroduction efforts of other species across the country. Together, we watched that reintroduction program succeed for a long period of time. And at one point, the population of red wolves reached 120 red wolves in the wild. But together, we've also experienced setbacks. And Today, we find the landscape once again largely without red wolves. So I am here tonight on behalf of the Interior Department to express our commitment to build back the success of this program. As the Assistant Secretary, I will stay engaged in the months and years ahead, to ensure that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has the support they need to be successful. Because what we want is to find enduring solutions for America's wolf. And those solutions are going to come through collaborative conservation that addresses the needs of the species and the surrounding communities. So to that end, we invite you to engage with us, not just tonight, but throughout our efforts to recover the red wolf. So again, thank you so much for being here and for your interest in red wolf recovery. I'm now going to turn the program over to our dedicated red wolf recovery team, who collectively have decades of experience in trying to conserve this imperiled species. So to get us started, let me introduce Dr. Katherine Phillips, who is the Assistant Regional Director in the service's South Atlantic Gulf and Mississippi Basins region. So Katherine, let's get started.
Let's see, Katherine, I've unmuted you from my end. You might need to unmute yourself from your end. Let me try again here. There we go.
I apologize for that. That always happens in a virtual environment now, doesn't it? Thank you, Shannon, for sharing your thoughts with us. I am so pleased to join you all tonight as we seek your feedback, your concerns, and your voices. Thank you for taking time to be here. My name is Katherine Phillips, and I lead the program in the service charged with recovery of red wolf and other listed species. I'm fairly new in this role, but I've been learning a lot about this program. It is clear that we have missed opportunities for engagement in the past, and I want to commit to you that we can learn from those moments and chart a future together in a manner that's more inclusive of all of your voices. And when I say all voices, I mean all voices. We're not looking for voices that just support what the program traditionally looked like. Please tell us what we did well and where we went wrong and how we can get it right. I want you to know that we are making changes to our program and to our approach. For example, we have revamped the membership of the recovery team to include over 50 individuals, from landowners to state agencies, to NGOs, to academics. But we recognize that this expanded group still doesn't represent this community fully. So we really want to hear from you. Some other changes we are making include increased levels of public engagement. We fully expect we're going to have more meetings just like this meeting more often. But that is just one way. We also want to talk with you on a more personal level. We are establishing a hotline that will give you a point of contact in the agency that can direct you to the right person to have your questions answered or your concerns heard. And we are committed to answering that hotline live, or when not possible, providing a response within a short turnaround time of 24 hours. We are also establishing a community engagement liaison. This will be someone who will be a close point of contact for landowners in the area. And these are just a few of the changes we're making, and I anticipate we're going to make more changes after we hear from you tonight. So tonight, we're going to address a few things: the status of ongoing activities in the Red Wolf program, the service's coyote sterilization program, how you can communicate with us after this meeting. I'm sure you may think of things that come up just from the presentation today, and you may want to ask a question after the meeting. We'll let you know how. Also, we're going to talk to you about how you can get involved in red wolf recovery. And then finally, we're going to answer your questions. And many of those questions, we're hoping that we can cover them in our presentation today. But before I turn it over to our team, I want to recognize the members that are here today. Not all of them have speaking roles, but all of them are dedicated members of the Red Wolf Conservation Team. Emily Weller, she is our recovery coordinator for the species. Pete Benjamin, He's the field supervisor for the Raleigh field office. Joe Madison is the manager of the North Carolina non-essential experimental population. Luke Lawless, he's a private lands biologist, and he will be our community engaged liaison. Ryan Nordsman is a wildlife biologist. Morgan Lewis, wildlife biologist. Sean Olson, our wildlife technician. And two Student Conservation Association Red Wolf interns, Alex DeLuca and Aubrey LeVar. And that completes our team. So I just want to thank the Fish and Wildlife Service team for being present. And with that, I'm going to turn over to the leading presenter tonight, our recovery coordinator, Emily Weller, who's going to begin the presentation. Thank you, Emily.
Okay, there we go. Thank you, Catherine. I appreciate that. Good evening, everyone. Again, my name is Emily Weller, and I am the Red Wolf Recovery Lead. Just for a few minutes, I'm going to give you some information on the red wolf itself, species information, and a little bit of background information on the recovery program as a whole before turning it over to Pete and Joe to talk about our North Carolina population. So first, the red wolf is a distinct species native to eastern and south central U.S. As Shannon mentioned, the red wolf is the only wolf species endemic to the U.S. While various studies have reached conflicting conclusions as to the origin and therefore the correct taxonomic status of the red wolf, in 2019, the National Academy of Sciences concluded that the red wolf is a taxonomically valid species. It's larger than a coyote, but smaller than the gray wolf, weighing in between 45 and 80 pounds. Some of the distinguishing characteristics include long, slender legs with large feet, broad muzzles, and tall pointed ears. Their diet varies depending on prey availability, but usually consists mainly of white-tailed deer, but also smaller mammals like raccoons, rabbits, and nutria. Once common throughout its historic range, red wolf populations were decimated by the early part of the 20th century due to intensive predator control programs, loss of habitat, and coyote hybridization. It is listed as an endangered species under the Endangered Species Act. Next. We have a lot of exciting things going on in the red wolf recovery program. Shannon and Catherine mentioned some of them. At this time, the service is focused on updating the red wolf recovery plan. The last revision to this plan was made in 1990. So many things have changed and new information on the red wolf has become available in the last 3 decades. We are updating the plan to better guide recovery actions given the current status and the new information that has become available. As Catherine mentioned, we have a great diverse team that has been appointed to not only update that recovery plan, but also develop a recovery implementation schedule. And we anticipate that these recovery planning efforts will include identification of potential new reintroduction sites. We're also focusing on increasing captive breeding. We're working with our species survival plan partners, that's our red wolf captive breeding program, to increase space capacity so that they can increase breeding capability. This not only ensures survival of the species, but will also produce a population capable of supporting future reintroductions. As Shannon and Catherine mentioned, we are revitalizing our efforts to recover the red wolf. We can't recover this species alone. With the patchwork of landowners that comprise the entirety of the Southeast, we need support from numerous people, private landowners, state agencies, general public, NGOs, academia, all of those to be successful. Therefore, we are focusing on collaboration and community and partner engagement to recover this species. We want to increase landowner and stakeholder engagement, communications, and transparency in all of our actions. And I can tell you that the team is really excited about moving forward down this new path. And finally, we are focusing on restoring the North Carolina population of red wolves. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Pete so that he can talk about that in more detail.
All right, Pete, you're unmuted and your video's on.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Emily. Good evening, everybody. As was mentioned, I am Pete Benjamin. I am the supervisor of our Raleigh, North Carolina Ecological Services field office that delivers Fish and Wildlife Service programs throughout Central and Eastern North Carolina. It's great to be with you here tonight. I wish we could be together in person. There were a lot of familiar names in the registration and a lot of new ones. So thank you all for joining us. We're going to start to focus in on the Eastern North Carolina red wolf population. And my job is to give you a quick summary of the history of that population. There's a lot that has happened, as folks have been around for a while know, but I'm going to try to be very brief. So the population was established in 1986 as a experimental non-essential population. Originally, based on the science available at the time, we thought Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge would support a sizable population of red wolves. And the original rules we wrote said that the population would be contained within the refuge, and animals that left the refuge would be captured and returned. And in the early days, we, as Shannon mentioned, we saw a lot of success. The population grew. The wolves, even though they were released from captivity, established territories, found mates, raised puppies, and the population grew. But it did very quickly start to prove to us that the refuge was too small to contain a sustainable population. Red wolves began to use private lands, and our rules changed over time to reflect that. In 1995, we modified the rules in recognition that the wolves were using private lands, and provided provisions in those rules for landowners to help us work with landowners to deal with issues that might arise on their property. Then the population continued to grow. But also in the mid-90s, the coyotes, which were not present on the Albemarle Peninsula when we started the red wolf introduction, had moved in. They'd covered the entire eastern United States by that time. And once again, a problem that was part of the threat to the extinction of the red wolf at the beginning, which was hybridization with coyotes. That's what almost drove them to extinction in the early 70s. Now coyotes are back on the peninsula, again, posing that threat of hybridization. So in 1999, we convened a meeting of experts and came up with what we call the adaptive management plan to deal with hybridization between red wolves and coyotes. And part of that plan, and Joe will go into it in more detail in a minute, involves sterilizing coyotes and putting them back out on the landscape so they hold territory, keep other coyotes at bay, and hold that territory until red wolves can move in and take it over. But in the meantime, they're sterile, so they're not, one, they're not producing more coyotes, and two, they're not breeding with red wolves. That program was very successful in dealing with the hybridization issue. But as the coyote population continued to build through the 90s and into the 2000s, more people became concerned about the increase in coyotes. More folks became interested in hunting and trapping coyotes. And that's when we started to see red wolf mortality increase as a result of gunshot. The animals are somewhat similar in appearance, and we think a lot of folks were shooting red wolves simply by mistake when they were out hunting coyotes. So that continued to grow as a concern. The population of red wolves peaked at around 120 animals, as was mentioned, in around 2012 or so, and it's been in decline ever since, to the point where our last known wild litter was born in 2018. As I mentioned, the rules have changed over the years, and also in 2018, we proposed another revision to the rules that would, an attempt to kind of deconflict the issue of red wolf management with coyote management. The proposed rules would have again restricted the red wolf population to Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge, like it was back in the beginning. We published those rules, proposed rules in the Federal Register. The public response we got was overwhelmingly opposed to that rule change. Also, at about the same time, some federal court made some rulings that affect how we implement the rules we have, and also indicated that the proposed rule change was not likely to be viewed favorably. So in last year, we withdrew those proposed rule changes. Next slide, please. So as it currently stands, just a brief synopsis of the rules governing the program. The rules we operate on are still the rules we published in 1995, with a couple changes as required by the court. So the rules do still cover the 5 counties: Dare, Hyde, Terrell, Washington, Beaufort. They do allow us to release wolves from captivity to build the population. They do allow anyone to take a wolf that is threatening human safety, and anyone can take a wolf that's in the act of killing livestock or pets. That's a given. Folks can also harass wolves if a wolf's becoming a little too familiar, causing you concerns, getting a little closer and you're comfortable. You can certainly harass a wolf, scare it off, as long as the manner you do that isn't injurious to the wolf. And if a landowner's having issues with a wolf that's not posing an immediate threat, but is behaving in a way that's problematic, the Fish and Wildlife Service or state biologists can assess the situation, and if needed, remove that animal before it becomes an actual threat. And we can also move animals around within the experimental population area for genetic purposes to form new pairs and hopefully increase the genetic health of the population. So our rules from 1995 until very recently also allowed said that we would remove wolves from private lands upon landowner request, whether the wolves were threatening or not. We can no longer do that per the courts. We also were able to issue authorizations to landowners to take remove wolves from the property if we abandon those efforts. We can no longer do that. So the only situations in which we can remove wolves from private lands is, as I said, if they are either an active threat or a potential non-immediate threat, or if we need to move animals for management of the population overall. Next slide, please. So to bring us up to a little closer to current time, like I said, we haven't had any wild litters born since 2018. Sorry, we began our efforts to increase the size of the wild population in 2019. Next slide, please. So what we've done in the last couple of years, in 2019, we brought a red wolf up from our island propagation site on St. Vincent National Wildlife Refuge. down in Florida. We moved that male up to Alligator River and released him in 2019. We lost track of that animal. We lost contact with him in 2020. That happens. The transmitter might go bad. The animal could get hit by a car and the transmitter is destroyed. Things like that happen. So his whereabouts are unknown. In 2020 and 2021, kind of last winter, we moved 2 more adult red wolves up from St. Vincent National Wildlife Refuge. Both were paired with resident females. We caught the resident female, we brought up the male, we put them together in an acclimation pen on 2 different parts of Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge. And then those after acclimation period, those wolves were released. One of those animals has integrated, has stayed with the pack we put him into, and we're hopeful that they will form a breeding pair. The other animal was struck and killed by an automobile. Also last winter, we translocated, moved 4 red wolves, 2 pairs, male and female, from the captive population, the population under human care, and released them, 1 pair on Pocosin Lakes National Wildlife Refuge, 1 pair on Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge. And unfortunately, 3 of those animals were struck by cars and 1 was shot. So that was disappointing. But also last spring, we fostered 4 pups into a wild litter. That was the wild litter was a result of a female red wolf and a male coyote. But what we do is we take puppies born in captivity that are about the same age as a wild litter that we happen to know about, and we insert those puppies into the wild litter. And since wolves can't count, they adopt them as their own and they raise them, and it's generally very successful. We do know that as of now, at least some of those puppies appear to be alive because we see them on trail cameras that we have out, and we'll start trapping this winter to try to capture those animals and put collars on them. So we're optimistic about the results of that effort. Next slide, please. And finally, just a summary. So in the last year, there's been 7 mortalities in the wild population. Those I mentioned, mostly 5 vehicle strikes, 1 gunshot, and 1 undetermined. By the time we found the animal, it was nothing but bones. And we could not determine the cause of death. So that hopefully kind of brings us up to speed, gives us a whirlwind tour of the wild population here in Eastern North Carolina. I'm now going to turn it over to Joe Madison to tell us what's going on currently.
Thanks, Pete. My name is Joe Madison. I'm the program manager for the Red Wolf Recovery Program here in Eastern North Carolina out of the Manio office. So oversee the management of the population here in Eastern North Carolina. So picking off where Pete left off, we currently have 8 known, meaning radio collared red wolves out there on the landscape within the NCNP. 7 of those 8 animals have the orange collars that we are now putting on red wolves to make it harder to misidentify that animal. And 1 of those is wearing a GPS collar, that being the male we brought up from St. Vincent last winter that Pete mentioned. And we are currently attempting to catch the 1 remaining known red wolf that has a black collar. We actually started those capture operations yesterday to replace her black collar with an orange one. The estimated total population, we believe, based on trail camera work and sightings and the pups that we fostered and things like that, we believe is less than 20 animals right now in the NCEP. Next slide. So currently we track and monitor all of the red wolves and the sterilized coyotes that are collared from the ground and from the air when we're able to, multiple times a week, and we get points for the red wolves multiple times a week. And the newly released wolves that Pete mentioned, or the upcoming ones, we monitor even more frequently to keep even closer tabs on them. We also routinely monitor with remote sensing cameras on the National Wildlife Refuges and areas with private land with landowner permission or landowner request based on activity they're seeing and that they call us about. We currently have about 40 to 50 cameras out, and we're constantly moving those around to where that we feel they need to be to monitor the different areas and get a sense for what we've got out there. We conduct capture operations from November through February, so we're in the middle of the trapping season right now. We do that to collar individuals, to potentially translocate animals to form new breeding pairs, to sterilize or remove coyotes, and just to monitor the population as a whole. And I will note, specifically with this picture, we don't trap when the temperature gets below freezing at nighttime for the safety of the animals. So January is usually one of our main trapping months, especially in areas where we think there's pups, because we don't want to catch those pups before the beginning of the new year to let them get a little bit larger before we try to put a collar on them. So that, with the way the weather's been this January, our trapping efforts have definitely been a little bit less than normal, but the weather's warmed up, at least for the next few days. We'll be trapping heavily in the high priority areas. Next slide. There's currently no fully functioning packs. And what I mean by that is we don't have in packs from a red wolf standpoint. You think of gray wolf packs. For red wolves, it's more of a family group. It's the breeding pair. They're young from previous litters, that yearlings, or maybe 2-year-olds sometimes, that hang around and help them raise the new pups before they disperse. And sometimes they don't disperse at all. But as Pete mentioned, that lack of not having a known wild litter since 2018, we don't have any proven breeding pairs out on the ground. However, that in that picture right there from Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge, the male we brought up from St. Vincent, we actually placed him in an acclimation pen with an older female that's past her breeding, because we were unable to catch the female we were hoping to put him with. And our hopes was if the mother sort of accepted him into the area, that the daughter would as well. And that's what we saw happen once we released him from the acclimation pen. He's over the course of the next month or so after his release, he pretty much went straight to where the younger female was, and she was with a sterilized coyote. And over the course of about a month, he displaced that sterilized coyote, and those two have been a pair since about March of last year. So they got together right after breeding season, and they've remained together. So our hope is that they're going to have successfully breed this year, and it'll be the first litter of many for those two. Next slide. This is a map of the general distribution of the wolves out on the landscape right now. You'll see in the upper right-hand portion, there's the Milltail pack, which is one of the 3 areas that has multiple red wolves, and it's the 2 females I just talked about, the mother and the daughter. The mother will be turning 12 this spring, so she's pretty old and past her reproductive years. And then it's the daughter and the male we brought up from St. Vincent, that pair I mentioned. And then if you go a little bit below them, you'll see the gator. It's a female, and that female, she was born in the Milltail area, and she's actually almost 13 years old. But she spent the majority of her adult life on the bombing range, and now she sort of goes back and forth between the two. And then moving further to the south, you'll see the boundary animals, and those are actually half siblings. There's a female red wolf and a male red wolf, and they pretty much use entirely private lands, multiple landowner private lands in that area. And then moving to the center upper part of the screen, you'll see the northern female. She's the one I mentioned that has a black collar that we're attempting to capture and fit with an orange collar. And then further to the left of the screen, you see the Pungo area, which is one of the other ones that has multiples, because that's the female that we fostered the pups with, and we have some video evidence are still in the landscape. and traps were actually set out there today to attempt to capture and collar those fostered pups. Next slide. So our plans for this winter, as were mentioned in the flyers and the public notice for this meeting, is to release 9 wolves into the NCNEP from the captive population to try to form new breeding pairs. And we've the areas that have been selected currently are unoccupied by red wolves and have adequate prey and are remote locations, or as remote as we could get on the National Wildlife Refuge. So the 9 are a family group of 5, which is 2 adults, 2 yearlings, and then a pup that was born in 2001. And they'll be released on Poquoson Lakes National Wildlife Refuge. And then there's 2 pairs that will be released on Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge on different areas that are currently unoccupied. The family group came to us from Rowan Wild, which is a SSP, a red wolf species survival plan facility in North Carolina. One of the pairs was an existing pair, and they came to us from North Carolina State University. And then one of the pairs was formed, newly formed in September. A female from Zoo Knoxville and a male from the Western North Carolina Nature Center were both transferred to the Endangered Wolf Center outside St. Louis, where they were put together to begin their bonding period in September. And then all of those wolves, red wolves, were transferred to us in late November, early December by those facilities. They'll all be fitted with orange GPS radio collars before release. They already have been. And they're currently in remote acclimation pens in the different areas that they'll be released, where they're receiving a limited human interaction, as limited as we possibly can. And they're fed only natural prey items on a irregular schedule. The releases of those animals will occur sometime in February or March. And it's based on a variety of factors such as weather, the individual behavior of the wolves, the pair status, if they're a new breeding pair or they're proven breeders, the reproductive status of the female, and things of that nature. So no set dates have been established, but it will be sometime in the next month to month and a half. Next slide. Oh, excuse me. We'll also pursue opportunities for forming additional pairs if they arise, although we're getting kind of late in the breeding cycle to be able to do that. And then in the spring, we'll evaluate opportunities to foster either with the same female or others, depending on what happens on the landscape. Next slide. So human-caused mortality is by far the leading cause of mortality for red wolves. A red wolf, based on research here, that dies of natural causes, the average age is about 9 years of age. If you factor in human-caused mortality, that it drops down to about 4 years of age. So it's a primary driver in the population dynamics, particularly when a red wolf in a breeding pair is killed, particularly in like fall, early winter, right as they're going into breeding. It breaks up that breeding pair and causes issues in the cycle. Vehicle mortalities have been the second cause of mortality over the life of the program. And as Pete mentioned, 5 of the 7 mortalities last year were as a result of vehicle mortality. So it's a major issue. So a couple of ways we've gone about in the short term of trying to reduce that with these new releases is one, trying to have these acclimation pens as remote as we could possibly get. But also we have fitted the radio collars with an orange reflective material on the bottom and the side to try to make them more visible in low light and along roadways. And you can see in that one picture, that dark picture, those 2 bright spots are the reflectors to kind of give you a sense. Now that's an infrared camera within the acclimation pen, so it doesn't show the color, but on headlights, that color is actually bright orange. So it's in line with the orange collar, and it makes them a lot more visible, and we hope more likely to allow motorists to avoid vehicle collisions with the wolves. Another thing we've done since the last releases is that we've partnered with the North Carolina Wildlife Federation to purchase 4 of the electronic mobile signs like you see there. And that picture doesn't give you the good idea of how big that is. That sign is actually 11 feet by 7 feet. So it's a pretty massive sign. And working with DOT on where and how we can place those, we've got a permit. We have 4 of those boards. And those will be deployed along roadways in the areas closest to where we will release the new wolves. And also they will be moved into areas where through monitoring, we know that red wolves are active in that particular area. In addition to those short-term efforts, we're working with a variety of partners, organizations, researchers on ways to explore other opportunities to, in the short term and the long term, to address the vehicle mortality issues so that we can reduce that down to the smallest number possible. Next slide. Gunshot mortality continues over the life of the program, continues to be the leading cause of mortality. So it's still a major issue for us. It's one of the main reasons that we switched to the orange collars 3-4 years ago to try to limit the possibility of misidentification of a coyote and a red wolf. So red wolves are fitted with those orange collars, and we're hoping that the orange reflectors will help with that as well in lower light and in situations where it shines, so that they can also be identified as a red wolf. So if you see an orange collar, it's a red wolf, and that means that it's a federally protected species under ESA, and that killing or harming them is illegal and can result in civil or criminal penalties. And Pete mentioned the rare occasions that there are exceptions. And I also want to point out that pups, as I mentioned, are too small to be collared. So they're vulnerable to both, from a size standpoint, be mistaken for a coyote, and they won't have an orange collar. So I would still urge you to think about the key physical diagnostics, because even a pup, as they start to get of any size, their legs look crazy long, almost like they're up on stilts. And we will continue to do outreach about the orange collars and what it means, and increase our outreach that it means a red wolf. And we're also looking into possible options for pups of how we could somehow mark them that would identify them as a red wolf, whether that be trying to put just an orange leather collar that doesn't have radio transmitters and things like that, so that they can handle the weight or things like that. We're looking at potential options. So we're always looking into new ways to make it less likely that they'll be shot for misidentification. And again, look closely for an orange collar, and if you see one, don't shoot. Next slide. And this is just a snippet of the hunter ID postcard that we hand out to folks and at the visitor centers, and WRC also hands them out during their, like hunter safety classes and those types of things. And it's another tool we're using, and it talks about the orange collars and talks about the comparison of the two animals and ways to help distinguish between the two. And we work with WRC and directly with the public, particularly hunters and trappers during hunting and trapping season, to try and eliminate the possibility of red wolves being mistaken for a coyote and being taken either through hunting or trapping. And we want to continue those efforts through all of our partners, and specifically WRC, to try to limit those instances of mortality. Next slide. Pete mentioned the coyote sterilization program, but I wanted to go into a little bit more in depth, since it's one of the key components of the red wolf recovery. As he mentioned, it's part of the adaptive management plan that began in 2000 as a result of a meeting between researchers, scientists, and a lot of different folks from diversity background. And the general, based on the home range size of red wolves, and the average pack size of red wolves is not that large. It's usually in the 4 to 6 range. Sometimes they'll get larger, but they don't have massive pack size. So typically within an established red wolf territory, you're going to have a much lower number of total canids. And it's going to be mostly red wolves, and they largely exclude coyotes in their well-established territories. That does not mean there's no coyotes in a red wolf territory, but the number of coyotes is substantially lower within an established red wolf territory. In an area with no red wolves, you're going to have a much higher total number of canids made up of coyotes, because they have larger home range sizes. So you're going to have a much higher density of canids made up of coyotes. And managing the coyote population is proven to be an effective means of reducing predation on popular game species like small mammals and particularly birds. Coyotes, as compared to red wolves, have a much higher diversity of prey species that they'll go after, particularly birds, as I mentioned. And they have a higher prey need over a given number of acres because they have a higher density of animals. Pretty much anywhere, and lots of research shows that if you remove a coyote from the landscape, it is very quickly replaced by one or more coyotes. And we see this ourselves if we, trap and have an animal that we're going to sterilize. Within a week, sometimes even we can tell that other coyotes have moved into that area. So, removal of a coyote it's a continuous thing. If instead you you capture that coyote and you sterilize it and then put it back on landscape, they sterilize it, they leave it hormonally intact. So it's not just a spay or a neuter, it's like a tubal ligation. So they are hormonally intact and they will continue to hold and defend their territory once they're re-released, but they can't breed. So it leads to lower coyote population numbers, particularly locally to where the sterilizations are occurring, but it also leads to lower prey needs because they don't have young, they don't have to feed the young, and it's just a lower density of animals overall. Next slide. Coyote sterilization is currently being done on the wildlife refuges and on private land with landowner permission. We never do capture operations or sterilizations or anything like that on private land without full discussions and agreements and permissions with landowners. And it's also done at no cost to landowners. It's currently paid for. We typically do the trapping, or if private trappers come to us or a land manager, if they've caught coyotes, they can come to us, and that the cost of the surgery of the sterilization is paid for by the Red Wolf Coalition. And we appreciate that. And it's performed by Dr. Christian Ford at the Chowan Animal Hospital, who's been a wonderful partner for us in this endeavor. And we appreciate his efforts as well. All sterilized coyotes are released back to their original capture location so that they'll go back to that territory and hold that territory. And if it happens to be a transient coyote, wherever they've been moved to, if they eventually have a territory, they're going to, hold and defend that territory. So the same principles apply. We used to use black collars on the coyotes for the sterilized coyotes, as you can see in that lower picture. But just this year, we have switched to white collars to increase the visibility so landowners can more readily identify if a coyote they're seeing is a sterilized coyote. Because there's benefits to leaving that sterilized coyote out of the landscape while it holds that territory and keeps other coyotes out that could come in and breed. Research conducted locally within the Eastern North Carolina has shown the coyote sterilization to be a successful management tool at reducing hybridization and controlling the coyote population to some degree. And it can be a benefit to landowners and their land management goals, depending on what their goals are. But if they're, trying to create habitat and increase population for game species, quail or turkey or something like that, it can be a benefit to landowners to have a sterilized coyote there that will defend that territory and limit the overall population size. And as I've mentioned, it benefits red wolf recovery. Next slide. So one of our more recent developments in our community engagement, and we see it as key, the community engagement, where we are always interested in talking to anybody at any time about the Red Wolf Recovery Program and things that we can do to assist or to answer their questions or concerns. And myself and the staff and everyone here, we're always looking for ways to increase that engagement. But one of the programs that we've developed to try to do that is what we call the Pray for the Pack program. And basically it's funded through, it's a program through the Fish and Wildlife Services Partners for Fish and Wildlife program, which provides the funding for the project. And it's a partnership between the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the North Carolina Wildlife Federation and the private landowners who voluntarily sign up for the program. The Fish and Wildlife Service provides the funding and technical assistance to landowners for habitat work to meet their land management goals that will also benefit prey species for red wolves such as white-tailed deer and rabbits. And depending on the agreement that's worked out between landowners and the Fish and Wildlife Service, we can fund up to 80% of the cost of the work that landowners want to do on their lands. And their contribution can be either financial or in-kind contributions, like, if it's a prescribed burn, doing the burn themselves or that type of thing. But it's important to note that the habitat improvement is tailored to meet the needs of the landowner's interest and the habitats that's available on each of the sites. So it's not a one-size-fits-all program. It's tailored to the specific landowner. In exchange for the funds and the technical assistance, landowners agree to allow red wolves to be present on their lands. And they allow some level of monitoring based on the landowner's preferences. And up to the landowner's comfort level, they allow the use of the adaptive management plan. And again, that factors into the percentages of the cost share. But I want to emphasize that the key to this program is working closely with the landowner to craft an agreement that supports their needs and their land management goals, such as improving game habitat for turkey or quail, while providing for the presence of red wolves. So working closely with each individual landowner to figure out what their needs are and how we can fit that is the aim of that program. And we encourage you to contact Luke, and you'll get his contact information later about if you're interested in Pray for the Pack. And it'll be it's always on the website, the contact information as well. Next slide. And I wanted to mention this as well, as we're asking the landowners trying the refuges to do some, potentially do some habitat improvements and, create early successional habitats or things like that. We're also trying to mirror that on the refuges to also provide better prey habitat and red wolf habitat. So we've partnered again with North Carolina Wildlife Federation on a habitat improvement project on Pocosin Lakes to do just that. And that will, as that matures, that project, it will benefit hopefully the family group that we will be releasing on Pocosin Lakes National Wildlife Refuge and future red wolves and wildlife on that area. Next slide. Another key piece of our community engagement is the Red Wolf Center located in Columbia. It was shuttered for a while, but it's actually been reopened for the past 3 years, except for during the key COVID closures and shutdowns. But it's back open through a partnership with the North Carolina Wildlife Federation and the National Wildlife Refuge Association. It's actually the education and outreach side of the Red Wolf Center is managed by a North Carolina Wildlife Federation employee, Katherine Phillips, who also develops the programs for there and oversees and recruits volunteers to help man that facility. The back half of that facility is a working facility for myself and the other biologists when we're working with red wolves and other type projects. But the front half is a small interpretation center, and then there's also a captive red wolf pair there that's on a display, a public viewing display. The Rev Center is currently open on a kind of call ahead scheduled basis because of the COVID restrictions and the number of folks that can be there at any time. But you can see Katarina's contact information at the bottom there, and if you call Pocosin Lakes Refuge, they can also get you in touch with her, and she can schedule a time to talk to your group or give presentations and those types of things. And along with the Red Wolf Center, we're always looking for ways to continue and expand our outreach and education efforts with our partners, and working with the species survival plan folks, the zoos and conservation centers is a big way we do that as well. Next slide. So I want to touch on how can I help or how can I get involved for folks that want to have asked that question, both in the participant questions and it comes up all the time when we're talking to folks. One, a key one is, if you're a landowner within the 5-county area, you become a Pray for the Pack participant and receive funding and technical assistance, like I mentioned, towards your land management goals. And in many instances, it's habitat work that these folks were already going to do, and now they're going to get some funding to help them do it. So it's kind of a win-win in that regard if it helps you meet your land management goals. Next slide. The other one is to contact us. If you're having issues or concerns related to red wolves, I urge you to contact us, to not, think that there's nobody here to listen, or that we're not going to come assist or to help or to help you with the situation. We are here, and we are willing and committed to talking with you folks about red wolf and your issues or concerns, or just questions in general about the program. We'll get contact information at the end, but I urge you, if you have any questions or concerns, to get in contact with you, and we'll do what we can to work with you to address your concerns. Next slide. Other ways folks can get involved is if you are visiting Eastern North Carolina to view red wolves, that supports the local economy of the local communities and the counties, where there's the only known population of wild red wolves. Things like guide services and lodging and food, all of that helps support the local area with red wolves as the backdrop. I also, you can visit some of the over 40 zoos and wildlife conservation centers nationwide that are part of the red wolf captive breeding program. Without those guys and the captive breeding program and the education outreach that they do, we wouldn't be able to do that. Right in line with, we can't do this without help from our state partners and private landowners as well. Next slide. I'd also, how you can help is, to remember to not shoot collared canids. It's illegal to shoot red wolves, meaning the ones with orange collars, or ones that you can identify through their characteristics as a red wolf. And it's to your benefit not to shoot the sterilized carries like I touched on previously, and those are the ones that have black or white collars. And also you can help by driving with caution in areas where there's red wolves, or, wildlife is everywhere. So just driving with caution in general, especially at dusk and dawn, when wildlife tends to move around the most. And if you see the signs out there, then take heed of those signs and slow down your speed and be extra vigilant as you drive through those areas. And I would encourage you to continue to do what you're doing here tonight, which is to engage in our recovery efforts, attending public meetings such as this, and providing comments on things like the recovery plan that, we'll have official comment periods. And I think while a virtual meeting like this may allow for some additional participants, I think we will all agree that we hope that we can get back soon to a time when we're having these meetings face to face, and it's more of a direct dialogue, so we can have these discussions and you can voice your concerns directly to that, and we can do our best to address those concerns and issues and answer your questions face to face. So hopefully we can get back to that before too long. Next slide. So the Red Wolf team is committed, available, and interested in working with the community regarding questions and concerns. And we are working diligently towards increasing our community engagement and transparency. We want you to know what we're doing. We want you to know what's going on out there and what our plans are. It doesn't serve us well to be tight-lipped or secretive about what we're doing. That's not our intention. We want you to know where we're, generally where we're releasing wolves, and we'll be contacting landowners when we know wolves are in their general area and to talk about them about any concerns. And I want to reiterate again that myself and the entire team is committed to working and collaborating with landowners to address the needs of the communities and the species. So I really encourage you to contact us. The general contact information is there. There's the Red Wolf hotline. It's been around for a while, but we've kind of revamped it, going to re-advertise it. It's manned. It will be answered. We will address your questions. It will go to the right person. Regarding Pray for the Pack and private lands, liaison type stuff, Luke Lawless is your contact. There's his contact information there, and it will be posted again at the end. And if, I encourage you to contact any of the Red Wolf team if you have issues or concerns, because we are here to answer those questions. Next slide. If you have questions specific to this presentation that you thought of or come up after this presentation is over, you can send them to that general email address that we look at on a daily basis, and it's somewhat easy to remember. It's redwolf@fws.gov. And answers to the questions that we either don't get to tonight or come in after the presentation, depending on the question. And if it's a question about somebody's specific land, we won't post that information on the website. But if it's a general question about information or problems or concerns, you'll get a response either through direct email, or we'll post all the answers that we've received, that we've worked on so far, and that we get in over the course of this on the Red Wolf Recovery website in the days following this program. And there on the bottom of the screen is our Red Wolf Recovery Program website address. And that was updated very recently, so it's pretty up to date and will be updated frequently as we move forward as part of our commitment to being more transparent and involving in community engagement. And with that, I will turn it back over to Amanda, I believe, who's going to talk about the question and answer session.
Thanks, Joe. And I'm actually going to let Katherine Phillips provide some quick remarks here before we move into that question and answer session. So Katherine, I'll go ahead and unmute you.
Thank you, Emily, Pete, and Joe. All right, back to all of you. Thank you for your attention. I hope you heard from us that we are committed. We are here for you. And as I mentioned earlier, we are planning more meetings like this, but also one-on-ones connecting with you. Recovery of the Red Wolf will take all of us moving forward together. Finally, I want to mention that we have received numerous online questions, and I know many attending tonight have questions too. Even though we may be unable to get to everybody, we'll focus on questions that multiple people have asked. And for those we do not get to tonight, we will respond the way Joe indicated via email on the website. So please know we are committed to getting back to you. So with that, let's start with those questions. Amanda?
Great. Thank you, Katherine. Let me go ahead and stop your video here and put you back on mute as we move on to our question and answer session today. Again, my name is Amanda Biederman with Environmental Management and Planning Solutions, a contractor for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and I'm going to be acting as your moderator this evening. So at this time, we are going to begin that Q&A portion of the meeting. And as we said earlier, we are going to first focus on and respond to those questions that were submitted by participants upon registration for tonight's meeting that are within the scope and ability of the service to respond to today. As Katherine just mentioned, if you feel that your questions weren't responded to today, or you have a question that you would like to ask service staff, again, you can see here on the screen these different avenues for how to submit those questions. And we also just sent those links out via the chat feature. So at this time, we're going to go ahead and move on to our first question, again, submitted by participants upon registration. So the first question is, how will the hybridization with coyotes be managed? And I'm going to go back to Joe Madison with the service to respond to that question.
So, I largely touched on that within the presentation, but just to kind of build on that, we conduct coyote sterilization on National Wildlife Refuge lands and private lands with landowner permission. And that's under a permit issued by the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission for the sterilization and coyote trapping management activities. The Red Wolf team here in Eastern North Carolina worked closely with as many willing landowners as possible, or those that request to trap on their lands and implement the coyote sterilization, which helps with the hybridization. And as I mentioned, it's paid for the actual surgery itself is paid for by the Red Wolf Coalition and performed by Dr. Ford. The coyote population management is an essential part of the Red Wolf recovery efforts here in North Carolina. And as we mentioned, if and when there's other reintroduction sites, it's going to be key there, since coyotes pretty much span the entire historic range at this point. But it's also a coyote population. Managing the coyote population is an effective means of reducing that predation on popular game species, such as small game mammals and birds. And it involves capturing, sterilizing, and radio collaring, and then releasing them back at the site of capture. And those sterile coyotes act as territorial placeholders, defending that territory from other coyotes. And they're not capable of breeding, which limits the growth of the population and really limits the hybridization events with wild red wolves, which again, research done here specifically in Eastern North Carolina showed to be quite effective. Sterilization doesn't affect the bond between a coyote pair that's mated for life, nor does it impact the size of their territory or the vigor in which they defend it, which all means that they will continue to limit the intrusion of quote unquote new coyotes within that territory, which is a benefit. Coyotes are typically captured using leg hold traps. And on private lands, the Red Wolf team and the landowner coordinate trapping efforts that occur during the winter. Again, it's up to the comfort level of the landowner. We're not out there when they don't want us to be out there. Like, we pull our traps during their hunt times, and we stay off their roads when it's wet because we don't want to mess up their roads and things of that nature. So it's all about the comfort level and working with the landowners so that it's done the way they want it to be done. And again, the sterilization is at no cost to the landowner. Prior to the release of the coyote, they're fitted with a white VHF collar so that they're identifiable and trackable. And part of that also is that so we can see over time, are these coyotes staying within the territory where we released them? And that's largely what we see. We've got coyotes that were sterilized in 2013 that are still have active radio collars that are still in the area where they were released 9 years ago. So that shows us that we're having it's working the way as it's intended. And we share that information with WRC as part of our monthly coordination calls about where the coyotes are and that type of information. When possible, trapping attempts will continue until all the coyotes on property are either sterilized or in some cases euthanized. We do still remove some coyotes in certain instances. And then trapping will potentially be reinitiated in an area when either reports or from the landowner or remote sensing camera or collar information tells us that that coyote is either in mortality or has been pushed out or something. We see unsterilized coyotes in the property, then we might reinitiate trapping on that property. And that's the extent answer on that one.
Great, thank you, Joe, for that response. I'll go ahead and put you on mute as we move on to our second question that was submitted. So the question is, has the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service defined what a, quote, pure red wolf is? And I will go to Emily Weller with the Fish and Wildlife Service to respond to that.
Hey, sure. So at this time, we only have a definition of a red wolf for management purposes in the North Carolina NEP. A canid with 87.5% red wolf genes is considered a red wolf. I would note that in the beginning of the program, that threshold was at 75%, but as the population increased, so did that threshold. So again, it's at 87.5% red wolf genes.
All right, great. Thank you, Emily, for that response. And I'll keep you unmuted here, or I'll put you back on unmute here shortly for this next question, which is, why isn't more being done to save the red wolves? Why are they not all over the East Coast where they belong? And I do just want to note that I am just kind of reading these questions verbatim as they were submitted upon registration. So I appreciate everyone for being respectful of differing opinions and viewpoints as we read through these questions. Let's see, Emily, I'll go ahead and ask you to unmute again.
Yeah, sorry about that. So currently there is only one population of red wolves in the wild. And while that population saw many successes and exceeded the original population target, there have also been many challenges that we have spoken about today. The NCNEP has rapidly declined due to anthropogenic mortality, such as gunshot mortality and vehicle strikes, and even coyote integration and hybridization, particularly at low population numbers. But with only one population in the wild, we know that additional populations are essential to red wolf viability and therefore its ability to persist in the wild. So we are focused on updating the red wolf recovery plan, which again, we do anticipate will include the identification of potential new reintroduction sites.
Great, thank you, Emily, for that response. I'll go ahead and put you on mute here as we move on to our next question. So our next question is, will there be potential for pup foster this upcoming season? And I will go back to Joe Madison with the service to respond to that one.
Thanks, Amanda. So yeah, we will definitely look at assessing opportunities to pup foster this spring and pursue them where it's feasible based on a variety of factors. First we have to have the presence of a wild litter to be able to do that, obviously, within the NCNEP. And we have to have the availability of captive-born pups that are of a similar age as the wild litter to be able to bring those pups in, because there's a very short window, 10 to 14 days old, that we have to do this. And the litter from the captive population has to be very similar in age within a couple of days of the age of the pups in the litter, so we can be successful at. So there's a lot of things that have to line up. But of course, the availability of a wild litter is the first step. So once denning season starts, we will assess that. And we also have to have access to the wild den. It either has to be in a place that's physically accessible, not over canals that we can't get across, and it also has to be on land that we have access to, either National Wildlife Refuge lands, mainly. And then while pup fostering has been shown to be a really successful method of increasing the population and reintroduction of red wolves into the population, under the current circumstances on the landscape, we have very limited opportunities to do it because we have no proven red wolf breeding pairs within the NCNEP, which we're working to correct as we've gone through. When you're conducting pup fostering, the preferred method is to add one or more pups into a litter of an experienced red wolf mother, or a pair preferably, that have proven parental skills that they've raised their pups. Because a lot of times, even in captivity, first-time mothers aren't the greatest mothers necessarily. They're trying to figure out what they're doing, and those pups can have lower survival in captivity or in the wild. So we try not to foster with first-time mothers. So as you saw from the presentation, there's not a lot of options out there. Now we're releasing pairs into the wild this winter in hopes that they'll have litters in the wild, but they will be released in relatively close proximity to the pup fostering season. So and they'll still be kind of figuring out getting their legs and being wild on the landscape. So they won't be ideal candidates. So anyway, the short answer is we'll evaluate the feasibility and availability of being able to do that this spring, but it is a potential option.
Great, thank you for that response, Joe. I'll go ahead and put you back on mute as we move on to our next question here, which is, are there any checks of DNA on large canids in coastal states? And I will go back to Emily Weller with the service to respond to that question.
Sure. Yes, there are studies underway to identify the possibility of red wolf ancestry still remaining in the wild in southwestern Louisiana and southeastern Texas. These studies are follow-ups on previous studies that suggest that there are red wolf ancestries still existing on the landscape in Louisiana and Texas.
Great, thank you, Emily, for that response. I'll go ahead and put you on mute and we'll move on to our next question. Again, right now we are moving through our questions that were submitted during when people were registering for this meeting that are within the scope and ability of the service to currently answer. We're going to see if we can make our way through this entire list of questions before we see how much time we have remaining on the meeting. So right now I'll just move on to our next question here, which is what penalties will be levied against hunters who kill red wolves? And I will go to Pete Benjamin with the service to respond to that question.
Thanks, Amanda, and thanks to whoever submitted the question. So yeah, red wolves, as Joe touched on this, red wolves are a federally protected endangered species. Killing or harming a red wolf can result in civil and or criminal penalties that may include fines and forfeiture of any property that may have been involved in the crime. That said, we believe that a lot of particularly the gunshot related mortality of red wolves is a result of mistaken identity with coyotes. So as we touched on tonight, we're stepping up our efforts to help hunters distinguish between red wolves, which are protected, and coyotes, which may be hunted. So we're doing things like the bright orange collars. As Joe said, we're looking at things we can do that maybe mark the young red wolves that are too small to carry radio collars. We're working with the Wildlife Resources Commission to get the word out through hunter education and the Regulations Digest and the hunter education cards that these orange collars are out there. And please look before you shoot, and do not shoot an animal with an orange collar, certainly, but also that those collared coyotes, which have the white or black collars, may be of value on the landscape as well. We're also continuing our coyote sterilization program, as Joe talked about. We work, as Joe mentioned, to do that, to hopefully help manage the coyote population. We also do remove coyotes from the landscape as needed. So we want to keep working with landowners and folks out there to find other ways that we can work together to grow the red wolf population while we manage the coyote population. Back to you, Amanda.
Great, thank you, Pete. I'll go ahead and keep you unmuted for this next question here, which is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is a federal agency that uses federal resources. So the question is, why is outreach targeted, if not limited, to the local community?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Katherine touched on this in her remarks, and we're interested in getting input and more engagement from all our stakeholders. We know that they come from all over the country and around the world. I'm very happy tonight to see that we've got folks signed up for this from all over the country. But tonight, one thing we really wanted to try to do was to engage specifically with the local community and make sure everybody was aware of our plans for this winter, the wolves we're going to be releasing, our efforts to work with you regarding wolves on your lands, opportunities that might be available for habitat management and prey for the pack. So that support, as I mentioned, wolves do make extensive use of private lands in the 5-county area. That's going to be true wherever reintroductions might take place in the future. So landowner support is absolutely critical for success of this program and for red wolf recovery. And so we recognize that fundamental change is needed in the way we engage stakeholders, across the red wolf recovery, but very particularly with those local landowners that may have wolves on their property. So so the meeting tonight's an opportunity for us to engage with the local community, to tell you what's going on, let you know what's coming up, and also to hear from you. But so that was the main target of tonight. But again, thanks to everybody that was able to dial in and participate. We really appreciate it.
Great, thank you, Pete. I'll go ahead and put you back on mute as we move on to our next question. Before we do, I realize that we do have quite a few phone callers on our meeting tonight. So I am going to quickly verbally read through those links that we sent out earlier via the Zoom chat feature for if you have any additional questions that you want to submit after the meeting tonight. So the Red Wolf hotline for those phone callers, if you want to grab a pen and a piece of paper, is 1-855-4-WOLVES. So I'll just read the number here. So 1-855-496-5837. So that is the Red Wolf hotline, or you can email your questions to redwolf@fws.gov. You can also contact Luke Lawleys, who's a private lands biologist and prey for the pack, at 252-256-3676, or Luke_Lawleys, LOLIES, @fws.gov. Or you can visit the website, and that website address is www.fws.gov/southeast/mammals/red-wolf/. So hopefully everybody had a chance to write that down. Again, this entire meeting is being recorded, so that will be captured in the recording as well. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and move on to our next question here, which is, what is your time frame for establishing a second reintroduced population in Okefenokee? And I will go back to Emily Weller with the service to respond to that question.
Hi, yeah, so we currently do not have a set time frame. Like I mentioned before, we're really focusing on updating the Red Wolf Recovery Plan, which we do anticipate will include the evaluation and identification of potential reintroduction sites as a high priority.
Great, thank you, Emily, for that response. I'll go ahead and put you back on mute, and we'll move on to our next question here, which is, what measures will be taken to ensure the safety of the released individuals in regards to human activity? And I will go back to Joe Madison with the service to respond to this question.
Thanks, Amanda. And I don't want to not answer this question, but I think we've largely answered it. So I want to make sure we have time to get to some of the ones that aren't new information. But again, we're touched on the same things that have been touched on with the bright orange collars and the highway signs and the reflectors and the public outreach regarding the orange collars are the main things that we're doing to help reduce mortalities. And we touched on the presentation and in Pete's previous answers.
Great, thank you, Joe. I'll go ahead and keep you unmuted then for our next question, which is, what can we do with the law and individual efforts to protect these beings?
And it's kind of the same situation with this question. I think we've touched on it numerous times, both in the presentation and with previous answers, but quickly, we continue to work with the local and state governments and conservation organizations, private landowners, and all other partners in Red Wolf conservation for, all sorts of different ways and engagements that we can do to try to increase this. And, having a broad support is essential to the future success of the Red Wolf Recovery Program. I hope that comes across tonight, that we neither think we can do it alone or want to do it alone. The Pray for the Pack is part of that way to increase individual efforts, or in coordination and collaboration. And our team manages non-essential population through a variety of activities, monitoring of the red wolves, remote cameras, assessing the movements and pack dynamics and the general health, investigating known mortalities, performing the veterinary care, the vaccinations, general health assessments, and those types of things. We're engaged in a lot of different aspects to protect the species, and we've touched on a lot of them here tonight.
Great, thank you, Joe, for those back-to-back responses. I'll go ahead and put you on mute as we move on to our next question, which is, what, if anything, will be done to stop all of the criminal poaching of these wolves? And let's see, I'll go to Pete Benjamin with the service to respond to that question.
Thank you. Yeah, so as I touched on, it is a violation of federal law to harm or shoot a red wolf. We work, our service, our division of law enforcement does investigate suspected illegal take, and we work closely with them to provide information. I can't talk about any specific cases, obviously, but I would go back to what we are doing to try to help hunters and others distinguish between red wolves and coyotes, which I hope will reduce the human-related mortality.
Great, thank you, Pete, for that response. I'll go ahead and keep you unmuted here for our next question, which is, will the Fish and Wildlife Service remove red wolves that enter a farm or other property if requested by the landowners?
Yeah, thanks for that. We did touch on this. I think I spoke to it in my presentation, but it's worth reiterating because things have changed with respect to this part of our rules. We can remove wolves from private lands under what are now pretty limited circumstances. Obviously, if the animal is posing a direct threat to people or livestock or pets, the land, if it's a direct threat ongoing in the act, the landowner can certainly take that animal. If it's a non-direct threat, but the animal is just behaving strangely and making a landowner uncomfortable, then we can assess that situation and remove the animal if need be. And we can also move animals, for the betterment of the population, to make new pairs, to increase the genetic diversity. But we can't anymore. We used to remove wolves from private lands on landowner request, whether the wolf was threatening or not. We can no longer do that per some court injunctions. And we also can't authorize landowners to remove wolves from their property on their own, except in those limited circumstances that I mentioned.
Great.
So one last thing I'll say there is, so if you are having any issues with wolves on your lands, as Joe mentioned, please reach out, please contact us. We want to work with you and address your concerns.
Great, thank you, Pete, for those responses. I'll go ahead and put you on mute as we move on to our next question here, which is, what is being done differently with this program that makes it seem more viable than the last program? And I will go to Katherine Phillips with the service to respond to this question.
Thank you. That's a great question. And I did touch on some of that in the intro. And I would say that the biggest thing is bringing more voices to the table. The service is committed to that. Increased transparency in our actions. So obviously we're doing that tonight. We're having more meetings. We're going to have that community liaison that's going to be, touching base one-on-one with each of you. So that increased connection. And also seeking your feedback and responding to that feedback and making adjustments. We're trying to pull you in to work with us shoulder to shoulder to make changes to this program, including how we can improve. We know that we will not be successful for recovery of this species without you.
Great. Thank you, Katherine, for that response. We'll go ahead and move on to our next question, which is how many wolves will be released to the Pungo? And I will go to Joe Madison with the service to respond to that question.
Thanks, Amanda. Yeah, so under the phase 2 release plan, as I mentioned in the Coastal Lakes National Wildlife Refuge, we're releasing a family group, but it is not in the Pungo area. So there is currently no animals scheduled to be released in the Pungo area. However, that family group will be further to the east on Coastal National Wildlife Refuge, and it is possible that all or some of those animals could potentially use the Pungo area at some point. And in addition, that, as mentioned, it may be an opportunity for pup fostering in the Pungo area. We just don't know yet.
Great, thank you for that response, Joe. I'll go ahead and keep you unmuted for this next question here, which is, what is the service going to do about the coyotes on Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge, formerly Zone 1 of the Hybridization Management Plan?
So I think we acknowledge this in the first question, that they're basically asking the same type of thing. So while I appreciate the multiple people asking the question, I think we've fully covered this at this stage.
Okay, great. Thank you, Joe. So then in that case, I'll go ahead and move on to our next question here, which is, why are these wolves being mandated by court order to be released? Are there a lot of hunters in these counties? And I will go to Emily Weller with the service to respond to this question.
Sure. So on November 16th, 2020, plaintiffs filed a complaint with the service alleging violations of the Endangered Species Act and the Administrative Procedures Act, the APA, in connection with management of the North Carolina NEP. Specifically, they alleged that the service interpreted its existing 10J regulations as prohibiting additional releases of captive red wolves into the NEP and prohibiting implementation of the Red Wolf Adaptive Management Work Plan. They stated that this interpretation constituted a new policy that was adopted in contravention of the ESA and the APA. Shortly after filing the suit, plaintiffs filed for a motion for a preliminary injunction to require the service to release red wolves from captivity. So on January 22nd, 2021, the court granted plaintiffs motion for preliminary injunction, determining that plaintiffs were likely to succeed on the merits of their claims, that the service adopted a policy preventing them from releasing captive red wolves into the NEP in violation of the Act and APA. The court's injunction barred the service from affecting this policy and ordered the service to develop a plan to release red wolves into the NEP.
Great, thank you, Emily, for that response. I'll go ahead and put you back on mute as we move on to our next question, which is, let's see, vehicle collisions are the second highest cause of red wolf deaths. Are there any plans to pursue new crossing money from the infrastructure bill? And I will go to Pete Benjamin with the service to respond to this question.
Thanks, Amanda. Yeah, Joe touched on some of the things we're doing in the near term to hopefully reduce the level of vehicle-related mortality with the reflectors and the signage. We're going to be monitoring the animals we release very closely. And you're absolutely correct. Throughout the history of the program, vehicle strikes have been the second leading cause of red wolf mortality. But in this past couple of years, it's been the leading cause. 5 of the 7 mortalities in the last year were vehicles. Vehicle related. So we're working, in addition to what Joe talked about, and I think he did mention it briefly, we're also working with a number of partners, researchers, state and federal transportation agencies, other organizations to look at other short and long-term solutions for reducing vehicle-related mortality. And some of that, we haven't hit on. Those discussions are ongoing, so we don't have longer-term solutions teed up. But some of it could certainly involve some of the funding available through the recent infrastructure bill, and we're gonna be pursuing that option. I will say that a lot of these recent mortalities are a result of us having to rely on these captive-born animals to rebuild the population. Animal that's grown up in a facility under human care doesn't grow up, learning things on its own about things like cars. So when you're relying on these releases of adult animals to rebuild the population, that's kind of an unfortunate consequence. We probably will see higher vehicle-related mortality. We're going to do everything we can this winter to minimize that. And probably the best thing we can do, though, is get back to the part where the population is building from animals born within the population and raised in that environment where they learn from their parents how to be wolves and how to avoid cars.
Great, thank you, Pete, for that response. So at this time, we did reach the end of our list of questions that were submitted by participants when they registered for today's meeting that were within the scope and ability of the service to respond to at this time. If you feel that your question wasn't adequately answered today, or you have additional questions that you want to send to the Fish and Wildlife Service, again, you can submit those questions to redwolf@fws.gov. You can also visit the website for more information and updates. I'll also flip back here briefly to some more information on the screen here. Again, the Red Wolf hotline is 1-855-496-5837, or you can contact Luke Lawleys, whose information is provided on the screen. Again, his number is 252-256-3676, or Luke_Lawleys@fws.gov. So I'll give everyone a second here to write down that information. All right, so at this time, we do only have about 10 minutes remaining here. So in the interest of time, we do know that a lot of participants are on the meeting today. So we're going to ask that you send any questions you have right now through the chat feature. So I have opened up that chat feature. It was turned off for the duration of the meeting so far. I have now opened up that chat feature. I ask that you send any questions you have to Ali Yamnitsky, who is the host of today's meeting. Again, I want to remind everyone that this is a public meeting in which we are accepting all opinions and thoughts on this matter, so you can send your questions over to her. Again, in the interest of time, we're going to at least record those questions in the chat feature, and the service can get back to you as needed after this meeting. But right now, we're at least going to open up that chat feature, give folks the ability to send their questions over to Ali Yamnitsky. Again, please don't send them over to me, Amanda Biederman. Please funnel those over to Ali Yamnitsky. You can go to that little drop-down menu and select her from that list of participants that are available to you and send your questions over. And we'll see what we get in the chat. If there are any that we are available or able to answer today, we will respond to those. So for now, please hold while we sort through those questions. All right, we did receive one quick question that I can go ahead and answer here for that participant. So the question is, what does NEP mean? Apologies if others didn't understand that acronym. So that stands for non-essential experimental population. So thank you for that question. Again, right now we are sorting through those, trying to figure out which ones that the service has the scope and ability to respond to today, but we are recording all of these questions. So even if they don't get responded to during this meeting, the service will follow up with you as needed after this meeting to respond to your questions. Again, you can send your questions over to Ali Yamnitsky, and we are recording all of those questions that we've received so far. Again, we're kind of sorting through those in the last few minutes we have here remaining so that the service can either respond to them live today or they can follow up with you as needed after the meeting. Again, this information is up here on the screen, and I'll also flip over to our other slide here to show you how you can submit your questions as well. All right, so we did get a question that the service is going to respond to here. So the question is, will more red wolf crossing signs be placed around the highways for safer wolf crossings? And let's see, I will go to Pete Benjamin with the service to start us off with this response.
Thanks, Amanda. Yeah, folks familiar with the area have seen the yellow red wolf crossing signs along US 64. And I think for now, as Joe mentioned, we're going to rely on those mobile signs that Joe showed. That'll give us a better ability to indicate kind of where wolves may be near the road in real time. We think that'll be more effective over the long term.
Great, thank you, Pete, for that response. I'll go ahead and put you on mute. Again, you can send your questions over to Ali Yamnitsky and they will be documented. We only have about 5 minutes remaining here. So again, we're sorting through those questions to see which ones we can respond to today. Again, I'll just read through some of that information on the screen as we wait for those additional questions. You can submit any questions you have to redwolf@fws.gov. You can also visit the website, which is fws.gov/southeast/wildlife/mammals/red-wolf/. And again, please send those questions over to Ali Yamnitsky by selecting her name in that Zoom chat feature. That Zoom chat feature is located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you kind of wave your mouse back and forth across the bottom of your Zoom screen, that chat icon should appear for you. All right, let's see. We have a couple more questions coming in here. So I'll read this question that we just received and then go to a few others. So the question is, let me back up here really quickly, is what volunteer opportunities are there for folks who would like to help red wolves beyond what has already been listed? And let's see, I'll go to Pete and then I'll go to Joe to help respond to this question.
Thanks. Yeah, as we mentioned, the Red Wolf Center in Columbia, North Carolina, runs programs to help get the message out and do education and outreach. Katerina Ramos with the North Carolina Wildlife Federation manages that operation for us. I would encourage anybody that lives in the 5-county area that would be interested in getting more involved to reach out to Kat.
Great, thanks, Pete. And any follow-up that you wanted to provide, Joe?
That's kind of what I had in mind, but I guess also, you know, if you're not able to be in the 5-county area, you can always volunteer with any of the organizations that support red wolf conservation in general, that are partners like SSP, the captive breeding population, and others like that.
Great, thank you, Joe and Pete, for those responses. I'll go ahead and put you back on mute. Let's see, we'll move on to our next question here, which is, you have 8 wolves for 35 years of work and 514 landowners who have kicked you off of their property. So the question is, what will be different this time? And I'm going to go to Katherine Phillips to provide a response to that one.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that question. I know that that's a difficult question because I could say that we share, there's a disappointment, you know, on the side of the Fish and Wildlife Service of where we are. There's no doubt about that. But I will say what's going to be different is we want to keep trying. It's important that if we make a misstep, if we haven't engaged in the way in the past that we should have, that we correct that. And now we're telling you that each landowner is important. Every single landowner, every voice of every landowner is important. So this time, we're going to make that a reality. We're going to engage you in a transparent way in the work that we're doing so that you know that your voice does matter, because we can't do it any other way. There's no way to be successful in recovery of red wolves on the landscape. It's not possible any other way. So we have to learn, and we have to try, and we have to change. And that's the only way forward. And I'm proud of the service being able to make this transition because I think that it's critical at this juncture that we make a change. So we're here to listen to you so we can figure out what that change exactly needs to be, because we don't have it right. And I'm certain that many of you may have some solutions that we can work with.
Great, thank you, Katherine, for that response. Again, we have just a few minutes remaining here, so we're going to see if there are any additional questions coming in via that chat feature that we can respond to live before I turn it back over to Katherine to lead everyone through some closing remarks. So we'll give it just a minute or two here more. Again, you can send your questions over to Ali Yemnitsky. I'll make sure for anyone who might have sent their questions accidentally to me, I'll make sure that I do save those for the record as well. All right. We have received a few additional questions, but at this time we are going to flip over to our last slide. You can continue to submit those questions, but at this time, I think we have reached the end of our question and answer session and have responded to all of the questions, again, that the service has the scope and ability to respond to today. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Katherine Phillips with the service to provide just some closing remarks for this evening's meeting.
Thank you, Amanda. I won't take much time with closing remarks. You've heard from our team today, and I thank all of our team for presenting the information and answering questions. But most of all, I thank all of you spending your time this evening with us. And I hope that you see and hear in my voice that we're committed to this change. I hope that you heard and saw that with the team, that we're committed to this change. And I just want to thank you and know that please give us the feedback, all of it, honest feedback. We're ready to listen. We're ready to make changes and adjustments to the program because we want this to be successful. So just thank you for your time tonight, and I hope you have a good evening. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Katherine. So I will leave this slide up here for just an additional 2 minutes until we reach that 9:00 p.m. Eastern end time. So you can get your questions over to Ali Yamnitsky. Again, we will save all of those for the record, and the Fish and Wildlife Service will do their best to respond to your questions if they weren't able to respond to your questions today. And Clayton McGee did just send out the information that is up on the screen. So hopefully you can easily copy and paste that out of the Zoom chat, save it to your computer, put it into your web browser so that you can get those questions to the service. Thank you everyone again for your time and participation this evening and all of your great questions. We really appreciate it. All right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and close out of our meeting tonight. Hopefully everyone had time to record the information that is on the screen and in the chat feature. Again, thank you everyone for your time and participation this evening. And the service will follow up with participants on where that recording for the meeting will be located and for the Q&As that we went through tonight. So thank you everyone, and I hope you have a great rest of your evening.